area of Bilad al-Rum, which means the Romans' lands, lie 4 kilometers west to Daheba and almost 20 kilometers from Siwa. It's situated opposite to Khamisa Spring and Mishandet Spring and their old villages. There are supposed to be villages and houses around that area, but unfortunately, none of the houses remained for 2 reasons. The first is the reclamation of land since ancient times and continuously. And the second reason is that most of the houses were built of mud bricks and rubble and trunks of palms and olives, and their existence close to the level of the surface water led to their demolition. In his book about Siwa, Dr. Fakhri has pointed out that this place could be a Byzantine church based on a text written in the manuscript of Siwa, which mentions that there was a group of Christians or Romans living in that place, and that's the reason behind the name of this area. The temple existed at least until 1869, when it was visited by Rolfs. Caio has described it in details, saying that it's one of the most beautiful monuments he's seen in the Oasis. It's the same Dorian temple mentioned by the early travelers. Its dimensions are 28 meters length from south to north and 7.5 meters breadth from east to west, with a height of 5 meters and thickness of walls reaching 80 centimeters. The entrance of Bilad al-Rum temple faced south and is composed of 3 halls following the Dorian style. In front of the halls was a colonnade 34 meters tall. These entrances were adorned with reliefs, but no texts were carved on the walls. The temple dates back to the 1st century AD and not to the Roman period. Dr. Fakhri also thinks that this place could be a Roman fortress, but new excavations done between 1997 and 2000 proved beyond doubt that most of the tombs adjacent to the temple or the fortress were dug according to the Greek-Roman tombs, and that its constructional elements go back to the Roman period in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, and are similar to the Dorian temple close by, which dates back to the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd century AD. The lands in western Siwa are distinguished with their height above the level of the water surface. That's why we find the cultivations that were cultivated in the past in them were seeds like wheat and barley, in addition to the olive trees and the palms. To the contrary are the lands in eastern Siwa, like Ati and Quraishat and Abu Sharuf and others, where the percentage of water salinity is high and the level of surface water is also high. El Jari mountain is the one below which lies the village of El Jari. It was used during the Greek-Roman period as a cemetery, where some tombs were dug in the lower foot of the mountain and most of the tombs were cut out in the upper half of the height of the mountain. There are about 184 tombs here, and most of them lie on the southern side of the mountain. This place is considered the main cemetery of Khamisa area and its surroundings. A monumental quarry has been recently found at the foot of the mountain opposite to El Jari spring. The stones cut out of that quarry were used to build the houses and the old buildings around the water wells of the Heba and El Jari and Karshun. In the quarry of El Jari mountain, some graffiti of the old Libyan language, the Amazighian, were found. This proves that during the use of that quarry during the Roman period, That was the language used by the workers. It's also noticed that the northern side of the quarry was used by cutting out tombs in it, which means that the tombs were dug in a later period. The foundations of a small temple were found in one of the newly reclaimed gardens. A tomb is composed of an internal burial chamber cut out in the rocks, with a ceiling that goes up to 1.5 meters. As for the front chamber, it was built by partial stones, irregular in shape, in addition to mud bricks, except for the sides of the entrance, which lied in the southwest corner. Even blocks of limestone were used in its building. The front chamber wasn't basically prepared for burials, but some of these chambers were used in later periods to bury members of the family. So there are diggings in the tiled floors of some chambers. These pits were 50 centimeters deep in the ground, and in some of them skeletons were found. The bodies were buried on their backs, facing upwards, with heads facing west and feet facing east, and both arms placed on the sides or by the pelvis, but sometimes the directions are reversed. It's noticed that some bodies were buried, then covered with a separating layer of sand, then other bodies were placed above them. Some masks were found over the faces of the bodies, and it's the first time these masks appear in Siwa. The material of which the masks were made is wax and resin. It seems that the method of making these masks was by pouring the liquid wax on the face of the deceased and let it to dry out. That's because pieces of cloth were found on each ear, nose and eye opening, which means that the one who was making the mask was very careful not to let any of these liquefied substances to enter the body. After the pouring, a careful operation of drawing and specifying the face details was made, showing the eyebrows and the eyelashes carefully. As for the hair, it was arranged according to the deceased hairstyle or the fashion of the time. Sometimes, white or colored glass was placed over the eye of the deceased from within. These masks are very similar to the masks or the portraits of El Fayoum. The middle level of the tombs of the land of the Romans, monumental area, is composed of 5 tombs that are almost similar to the ground level of tombs. They are distinguished by the existence of bases in front of each tomb. There are 2 or 4 bases of columns that had the Dorian style. Beside these bases, 4 capitals of columns were found, 2 of the Ionian style and 2 of the Dorian style. The first tomb is quite interesting, as it's composed of 3 internal chambers and the outer 2 built of mud bricks, with wells covered with plaster as well as the floor. Lintels are found on both sides of the entrance, and they were used for putting oil lamps or flares inside. Sarcophagi were found, composed of stone slabs that were cut out in the form of a sarcophagus. Plaster was used to join between them. The length of each of the sarcophagi is 2 meters, with a breadth of 60 centimeters by 50 centimeters high. Each sarcophagus contained a body or 2, with a layer of sand separating between them. Just skeletons and cloth were found inside. But above each coffin, at its southern end above the head, a gravestone was found. The first tombstone comprised 8 Greek lines. It starts at the top with a sunk relief of 2 palm reeds opposite each other. That was followed by geometrical design composed of dots and squares. The sides of the pallet is decorated with 3 equal lines in a geometrical form. The bottom of the stone is missing. The Greek lines say, "Farewell to the spirit of Eulogius and his mother, servants of Jesus Christ, 60 years old. Lord, save their soul." The second tombstone is 45 by 23 centimeters. Its middle is sunk relieved in Greek and colored in red. It has 8 lines and is a part of a cornice or lintel and was reused later. Hatayat Khamisa is considered one of the most fertile lands in Siwa and has the best types of olive gardens that produce the best quality of olives. It's famous for other crops too, and in spite of that, the rich landowners of the village do not live in it, but own houses in the city. As for the houses that exist in Khamisa, they belong to the workers. The village is called Khamisa after a queen who's supposed to have ruled the Oasis, and the legend goes that she owned a treasure and that it was hidden somewhere at the edges of the garden at a hill called Khamisa too. According to the manuscript of Siwa, which contains the local history of the Oasis and was written in 1883, there were 30 springs in Khamisa, but what remained usable are very few. Besides, its water is wasted, as it pours in the salty lakes of Khamisa and El Maraki. Most of these springs are old and filled with sand, but it seemed that this land remained prosperous after the Roman period. In the 15th century, the famous historian Il-Makrizi described this area to be vast countries that comprise a big number of palm trees and fertile lands and water springs. In 1950, the government started to clean and purify the old springs in this area, which were filled with sand. The purpose was to start an experimental project to reclaim the land and dry part of the salty lakes of Khamisa and Maraki, but unfortunately, the project stopped. In a close range to the water springs of Khamisa and at the western edge of El Hataya lies on a relatively short rocky hill a temple. That temple was built with bricks of sandstone, many of which are irregular in shape and size. Its walls are thick and it's used to be square in shape. There are no reliefs or constructional elements that are clear enough to tell about it, except for the thickness of its walls and the way of its building. Stones were used in the outer parts, while the inner walls were filled with rubble and plaster. This method most probably goes back to the Roman period. The measurements of this temple is as follows. The west and east side is 9.3 meters, and the north and south sides is 14.30 meters. The main entrance lies in the middle of the southern wall, and its width is 1.55 meters. About 4 meters west of the temple, there are foundations to walls that belong to the same age of the temple. There are settlements and attached buildings that were serving the place. As a result of the abundance of water in Siwa and the continuous flow of its springs along the years throughout history, it became inevitable to construct canals to drain the excess water that's not used by the springs. Thus, the drainage system in Siwa was founded since the most ancient pharaonic and Greek-Roman period. There are 4 lakes in Siwa. They are El Maraki Lake, Aghurmi Lake, El Zaytun Lake, and Siwa Lake. The total area of these lakes is 42 square kilometers, or 11,020 acres of land. When we learn that the total area of Siwa Depression is 1,088 square kilometers, then we'll realize that the lakes occupy almost 4% of the whole oasis area. The area of the lakes increases and decreases according to the amount of water it receives. Between the 70s and the 90s of the last century, the area increased and reached 62 square kilometers as a result of the increase of springs and wasted water. In 1960, the cultivated land was almost 2,500 acres, which means that the lake's area equals 4 times the cultivated land. They have existed since antiquity, at least since the advent of Alexander the Great to the oasis, for he marched beside one of them before he reached Amun's temple. El Maraki occupies the western part of the depression. It was known for its fertility since the Middle Ages and is still famous for the good quality of its fields. Most of its recent inhabitants are Bedouins from El Shuhaibat tribe who reside here with their cattle. Few of the oasis's inhabitants live amongst them. This place must have been heavily populated in the Roman times, for there are so many hills on its sides, carved with cut-out tombs. This fact proves that there used to be a big population living in El Maraki for a long time. Amongst the most important places there is Qaret el-Wazidi and El-Zawiya and El-Galati and Abu Madi and Ghergheret and Hatayet Abd el-Gabbar and finally Kuwait Shiza.